today's a special day. Somehow, what are 7 10-year-olds doing here? Everybody still 10? Okay, 7 10-year-olds doing in here. And where does that intersect with Ronnie Stevens? And where does that intersect with the center? I'm going to tell you. Tatiana Crowder is an amazing human. And she's blessing so many people in so many parts of her life that it's hard to pull it together. She came here from Liberty University directly after leading the team to the big dance, right? As captain, one time, right? And then she chose, that wasn't enough, she had a lot of opportunities. She chose to come to Memphis and be an MTR resident. Who's familiar with that program? Shining light all over the city, embedding teachers in so many different schools. I bet you're in 50 schools now and spread out. My daughter is now recently really fond of her crosstown teacher who came from MTR, but she wasn't while she was there. Now she said, that's my best teacher ever. It took a whole year of college to figure out. But she came here to do that. And then recently, and she really has a family and an adopted family. But recently, her family needed her, and she, as a 28-year-old who's finished her time as residency as MTR, now is at Brewster Elementary teaching 3rd grade math, now has a niece and a nephew that live with her every day, and she's raising, right? DJ, you want to raise your hand? All right. 28 and a 10 and a 5-year-old. And if that's not a lot, then she watched some of us coach flag football, and it's kind of anemic. She did yell a few basketball cheers during the football game, but basketball coaching during the football game, I noticed like that's kind of a basketball thing to say, not a football. DJ, did you like that first team of flag football? Yep. And now she's coaching these boys. And the first time I showed up for practice, I showed up just to pick up my son. And what I noticed was complete command. Who loves their coach? Okay. Complete command of these kids. And I noticed some guys like me and Jim standing around going, wow. Some guys who, guys our age can think, oh, no, I'm going to coach and I'm going to get my kids to do this and do this. And we know there's gym rat. And yet she had a command like I've never seen, and we were all learning from her. And then she told me to keep time. So I kept time. I've been an assistant ever since. And she told me what to do. People listen to her, and they do it. So I've been listening to her. But we established, and then Ronnie Stevens shows up at a game because his grandson is right here. John Selden, raise your hand. You're famous, right? So he sees, and he goes, and he's just amazed. So grown men everywhere, 10-year-old boys, love her. Pastors are saying she has a command. She's special. And maybe somebody I really follow and I try to learn a lot from said it'd be what if we could bless her in a certain way. And so the center exists to spur on leadership. So we've created an award. It says right there, the Servant's Heart Award. And she embodies that in every single way. And I'm just going to go a little further. That's just some of the fun around there. And then here's what the award said. For the person who displays unwavering purpose and perseverance in the work God has given them. Her theme word, it'd be hard to say, is obedience. And it's amazing. And then as Ronnie and I were talking about this event, in talking on leadership, he chose to teach on 1 Samuel 17. And this is, I can spoil this just a little bit. David and Goliath. First things first, what David says more than anything, he says he's doing this for the name of the Lord. And the verse that really hits me is what Paul said when he'd done enough. He'd done enough. He'd raised churches in Ephesus and around Asia. And he was going to head back to Jerusalem, and a prophet showed up and said, if you do that, prophets, Agabus, who had correctly prophesied the famine that Paul raised money for. And then he shows up and he kind of demonstrates in a skit, here's what's going to happen to you if you go. You're going to be beaten and bound. And he eventually say, I know. weeping and breaking my heart. The Lord's will be done for the name of the Lord. And I think he says it in the opposite order there in Acts 21. But that's what I see. I see in our teacher in a minute, I see these same things. Someone who keeps going. And in Tatiana, there's a slang for this award is somebody who just keeps going. And so we all help me welcome, and not that you're just coaching the boys and teaching people to coach. One more thing, the boys are memorizing verses. Does anybody want to shout out a verse? DJ, you do it. Awesome. Way to go. Yeah, verse a month, that's what she did. Let's welcome Tatiana up, please. To prove here's your plaque.
Thank you.
To prove we're serious in this business, we've got 12 spots. We're planning on doing this for the next 11 years and then much more. So you're the kickoff of an award here, and we're grateful for you, so many of us. All right? Thank you. We'll hold it. All right, thank you, Coach.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now, Ronnie Stevens is going to come teach us from 1 Samuel 17. And just so you know, so many of us, for 3 years, we've been using his daily devotionals, 2 in John and 1 in Acts. And so we kind of know, guys, we kind of know how he talks, don't we, Scott?
We do.
All right. And we're grateful to have you. Thank you.
So I add my word of greeting to those you've already heard. In the wonderful name of Jesus. I realize that some of you are here because what you do at Friday lunch is you come to the center. And some of you are here because you came to honor Tatiana. And some of you are here because you didn't know I was going to speak. So those of you in the last category, sorry. Hope the rest of your day goes well. By the way, I didn't know until just now that Tatiana taught math. And I want to tell you, I'm even more in awe. I think it has something to do with numbers. But C.S. Lewis said, I could never proceed very far in the jungle of science before being consumed by the lion of mathematics. And that's been my experience for sure. So I'm so glad that Howard, when he mentioned leadership, he didn't say leadership for the first time. He mentioned servant leadership. And I'm so glad, I didn't know what he was going to name the award until just now. I wasn't clear on that. I'm so glad he put servant in the award. Because I told him, when we were talking about what I should speak on, I said, well, probably something about leadership. The people who know me well would laugh at that. There are 3 things mainly that a pastor brings. I've been a pastor all my life. I pretended to be a missionary for 25 years, but I was actually a pastor who lived overseas. And I pastored churches in Moscow and in Munich and in Budapest. And a pastor basically brings 3 things. He brings teaching, preaching. He brings shepherding, pastoral care. And he brings leadership. You heed, you feed, and you lead. That's what a pastor does. In terms of my gift set, by far the least of what I contribute is leadership. That's one reason I know a lot about leadership. A person who can never lose weight knows a lot more about losing weight than people who've never worried about their weight. I'm an expert on losing weight. I know a lot about it. I know a lot about leadership because I realize what a huge deficit I have in that area. So I'm not going to teach you anything about leadership. I hope to teach you a little bit about David. And the theme is first things first. If you have a Bible, turn to the most famous story in the world. I'm pretty sure it is because it transcends Christian cultures. People in pagan cultures know what you're talking about if you say David and Goliath. To a Christian, okay, something about Jesus is probably our most famous story. But to the world, the story of David and Goliath may be the most famous story in the history of the world. What's the first thing we learn from David in 1 Samuel 17? I'm not sure I said the chapter, but Howard said it. 1 Samuel 17. Do you aspire to be a leader? Do you have an ambition to be a leader? Let me give you a first thing. Crucify it. Crucify the ambition and seek to be a servant. The second thing we have to do is we have to decide who our leader is going to be. You never learn to lead unless you learn to follow. And the question is, are we being led by the culture? Are we being led by the Lord Jesus? Those churches, a high percentage of those churches which appear to be the most successful are the churches that are following the culture. They're not leading the culture, they're following the culture. Their leaders moisten their finger and stick their hand in the air and calculate which way the wind is blowing. They run to get ahead of the wind in our culture. I can give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. 60 years ago, there wasn't a Super Bowl. 60 years ago, most evangelical Christians went to church at night. It's okay for a church to have a Super Bowl party. It's not okay to have a Super Bowl party instead of a worship service. That's not okay. Let me give you a suggestion next February. On the day of the Super Bowl, find an evening service and go to it. If your church doesn't have an evening service, my church doesn't. Find an evening service and go to it. If you do, it will be a revolutionary act. A revolutionary act against an all-pervasive culture which rules most apparently successful churches. Now, one reason I'm talking about this right now is because on the day that David became the most famous man in Israel, he wasn't a man, he was a teenager. And on the day that he began to be the most famous person in the world in his generation, how many people not connected with David can you name in the 11th and 10th century? I'll tell you the answer right now. Nobody. Nobody. But he wasn't seeking anything grandiose on the day he began to be the most famous person in the world and one of the most successful leaders who ever lived. He wasn't just a leader, he was a ruler. And he was a warrior. He was a warrior king. He taught Israel how to war, and he taught us how to worship. That's why the middle book of the Bible's hymn book, was mostly written by him. But on that day, he wasn't seeking to lead. He wasn't seeking to do anything grandiose. He was seeking to follow the inglorious and obscure assignment of his Father. He was trying to do what his Father told him to do. And what did his Father tell him to do? I want you to take some grain, and I want you to take some cheese to your brothers who are doing something really important at the front. What were they doing? They were cowering. What did you do in the war, David? Well, I carried the cheese. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to carry the cheese. Replace your ambition to lead with a willingness to serve. Jesus said, the one who would be greatest of all must become servant of all. That's the great one. You know what? Here's what that means. It means when you watch that single mother trying to keep 8 tables happy at Ruth's Chris or Folks Folly, you need to realize that she has more favor in heaven than the CEO or the plutocrat waiting for her to refill his wine glass, who could afford to eat at Ruth's Chris every day if he wanted to. who is the blessed one? Jesus tells us who the blessed one is. It's the servant. The servant is the greatest one. You know, we may not always have somebody to lead, but we'll always have somebody to serve. I've been a pastor for 40 years. I hear what people don't like at church. Sometimes they don't like the fact that nobody was friendly. Sometimes they don't like the fact that they can't penetrate the clique. That's the last reason I heard from a couple in my Sunday school class as to why they're not going to Harvest anymore. They just couldn't find a group to really fellowship in. And I always answer it this way. I'll guarantee you there's somebody further on the periphery than you are. Find them and serve them and bring them toward the center. Now, how do I know that? I know that because they're talking to a pastor. And there's a lot of people in church who wouldn't dare approach a pastor and talk and really say what he really thinks. So you're further toward the center than that person is. Go find them. And stop seeking somebody to serve you. You go find somebody to serve. And you know, that's where you'll find your greatest fulfillment. If you ask most Christians who wrote most of the New Testament, they'll say Paul, and they'd be wrong. Paul wrote the most books. Luke wrote the most words, unless you count Hebrews, which I don't. I'm not a scholar. I'm just a student just like you are, but I'm pretty sure Paul did not write Hebrews. And what that means is that Luke wrote most of the New Testament. Now, how did that happen? Think of all the reasons not to write a third gospel. Number one, it had already been done. Number two, it had already been done twice. Number three, it had already been done perfectly twice. Number four, it had already been done perfectly twice by people who knew Jesus personally, which Luke did not. Think of all the great reasons not to do it. Well, why did he do it? He did it to serve one person. One person named Theophilus. We don't know a lot about him. Some Christians think it was the first catechism. Some scholars think it was Paul's legal brief. I don't think Theophilus was a Christian yet. I think he was leaning that way, and Luke was trying to get him over the hump. Even by the time he wrote Acts, he still wasn't quite there. What happened? Because a doctor who became a missionary decided to become a writer so he could serve one person. One person. What happened from that? Well, I said the story of David and Goliath may be the most famous story in the world. I'll tell you another famous story. Story of the Good Samaritan. The story of the prodigal son. Do you know that we would not know what those phrases meant if Luke hadn't decided to serve one person? He's the only person who tells us about it. Do you know that the ancients gave Latin names to 4 hymns at Christmas? The Benedictus of Zacharias, the Magnificat of Mary, the Gloria in Excelsis Deo of the angels, and the Nunc Dimittis, now let your servant depart, of Simeon. We would know nothing of those 4 Christmas hymns if it weren't for Luke, because he's the only one who tells us about them. We would not know the connection between Jesus and the word manger. We would not know the connection between Jesus and the words swaddling clothes. We know nothing of the shepherds who rushed to Bethlehem. There was a German scholar who said, you know, the childhood of Jesus is like a scented garden. We can, a scented walled garden, a scented garden with a high wall around it. And we're so conscious of the fragrance wafting over that wall, but we can't see past the wall. There's one bouquet thrown to us over that wall. Jesus in the temple at age 12. Guess who threw the bouquet? It was Luke. We have that little snapshot of Jesus' childhood because Luke chose to serve one person. You want to be a leader? Crucify the desire and embrace the opportunities to serve. They're everywhere. You just got to look for them. You know what? Don't worry. I'm going to get through these other 7 points really fast. Okay. Fourthly, become a connoisseur of fear. Choose what you're afraid of like a gourmet chooses an entree. Don't just embrace any fear. Choose it widely. Wesley said, "Give me 100 men who fear nothing but God, and I'll change England forever." You gauge a man or a woman's maturity by what they're afraid of. A child may be afraid to sleep in the dark, but he's not afraid to play on the railroad track. It's a mature person who fears what's really dangerous. I mention that because one of the most prominent declarations in chapter 17 is in verse 24 when the writer tells us they fled from Goliath because they were dreadfully afraid. The last thing that we should be afraid of is death. And you know, one thing we should covet, we're all going to die anyway. You realize how much glorious it would be to die in battle, in the right battle, than to die in bed weeks before you were able to take yourself to the bathroom? Sorry to be crude, but that's what we're facing when we covet biological life over valor, over obedience. Be selective with your fears. Fear not accomplishing God's will in your generation. That's one of the greatest things in the Bible that's said about David. He accomplished God's will in his generation. Be afraid of not knowing all the benefits that Christ died to give us. Be afraid of being far less than what we could have been if we were fearing the right thing and making choices accordingly. Fear displeasing God this day. Fear a tendency to please our flesh or the world, which means we're pleasing the devil instead of the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Fifthly, covet the highest reward. It's not wrong to covet rewards. I recommend it. Just be sure you're coveting the highest rewards and the best rewards. You know, David went up and down the line saying, hey, what's going to be done for the person who shuts that ogre's mouth out there who's blaspheming the God of Israel? What's going to be? He was getting a clarification. What's the return on investment here for somebody who's willing to risk his life to shut that man up? Here's the question. Who do you want to reward you? You want the government to reward you? You want your company to reward you? Or do you want Jesus to reward you? Second question. When do you want to be rewarded? You want to be rewarded early or late? You want to be rewarded first or last? My father retired at age 49. He owned 30 cars, 4 houses, counting a mobile home, and an airplane. He knew early rewards. I didn't buy a car till I was 40 years old. My father gave me a new car just all the time. He only gave me one car that was used. My high school graduation present was a brand new Corvette convertible. And I paid for my father's last car repair because he couldn't afford it. And I was a missionary. I paid for, my father owned 3 different airplanes, not at the same time. I paid for his last airplane flight. He couldn't afford it. I didn't pay with cash. I couldn't have paid with cash. I paid with my frequent flyer account. My dad was rewarded early. My dad used to own a house at the lake and a house at the beach and a mobile home on the Intercoastal Waterway and the house near Atlanta where we lived. On the day he died, he was living with my sister. He didn't own a house. You know, you don't know who wins until the game is over. After the 2016 season, I watched the Super Bowl in the middle of the night with 40 missionaries in an international Christian school in Baku, Azerbaijan, on the banks of the Caspian Sea. And with 2 minutes and 30 seconds left in the third quarter, the Atlanta Falcons were leading 28-3. I'm from Atlanta. And no team had ever come back from a 15-point deficit in the Super Bowl. I think you know what happened. We don't know who wins till the game is over. We don't know who the heroes are until the game is over. Who do you want to reward you? When do you want to be rewarded? Now, those chilling words which he repeats twice in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6 about religious hypocrites. They have their reward. Chilling. They have their reward. You have your reward already? I hope not. I hope not. I pray you're banking on a later reward. That's an eternal reward, which can never be forfeited. Sixthly, expect opposition, not just from your enemies, but from your nearest and dearest. David's big brother Eliad said, "What are you doing here? Causing trouble. Go back to those scraggly sheep you take care of in the wilderness." That begins in verse 28. You know, when Jesse came to, when Samuel came to Jesse's house, Eliab expected to be anointed. He was the firstborn, but he wasn't. That teenage shepherd with those scraggly sheep, he was the one who was anointed. I think Eliab was still carrying a grudge over that. By the way, if you read that sequence in 1 Samuel 17, I don't know if you've ever read ancient literature outside the Bible. When you read the Bible, which is of course ancient literature, it resonates because it's transcultural and because it's transgenerational, because it's the Word of God. It's not parochial. It's not Western. It's heavenly and global. And but if you read other ancient literature, man, you're staring into an abyss of time, and it's very difficult to relate to it. We can really relate to this exchange when the big brother says, "Get out of here and go back home." And David says, "What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Can I just ask a few questions?" It's so contemporary for the dynamic between big brothers and little brothers. You know why? Because it's true. And because it's the Word of God. Expect opposition, not just from your enemies, but from your nearest and dearest, because the choices you make may seem suicidal financially, logistically, and nobody can understand it who doesn't know God, who's not following Jesus. By the way, on the way down here, I saw a new bumper sticker. I got behind a Lexus ES350. DeSoto County tags, you know what it says? You know what the bumper sticker said? Do you follow Jesus this closely? I thought that was great. Never seen that one before. Jane said, we got to get that. And, you know, if somebody's not following Jesus, they think you're wandering in the tall weeds. They think you're headed for the cliff. I could talk about that a minute, but I'm not going to. I got to keep going. I've already gone longer than I told Hart I was going to go. Seventh thing, act as if God is alive. The only other person who mentions God in the passage is Saul. And when he finally relents and allows David to go into battle, he says, God be with you. What did that mean? It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything in the mouth of Saul. It meant, see you at the funeral, kid. That's what it meant. David cites the living God, the living God, the God who's alive, the God who's alert, the God who's aroused, the God who's going to do something. You know, forgive me a personal prayer request. Everything is a test, okay? When you're tested, act like God is watching. Act like God will reward. Act like God is active. Act like God is involved. Act like God maybe just might do something. My son moved to California in February of 2020 to be a pastor of a little church. February 2020, March 2020, COVID shut everything down, and nobody was shut down tighter than California. About a month ago, my son-in-law accepted his first call to be a senior pastor at a little church in Campty, Louisiana, population 1,000. It's a paper mill town. Yesterday, it was announced that the paper mill is closing. What if FedEx, AutoZone, International Paper all exited Memphis on the same day? That wouldn't be nearly as bad as a town of 1,000 losing the paper mill. You know what I told them? God told Abram to go to Canaan in Genesis 12. You know what happened when Abram got there? There was a famine. Fix bayonets in March. God is alive. God is alive. We had a plane crash that shook our church to the core. The wisest thing I heard through the whole time, an elder named Jack Hurdle, he went to a church plant. He's like Caleb. He's still looking for mountains to conquer. Almost as old as I am. Wisest thing I heard during that season. Jesus didn't die in that plane. Jesus didn't die in that plane. David acted like God was alive. He will deliver me. The Lord of hosts, verse 45. The Lord will deliver, verse 46. The Lord does not save by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord, verse 47. Who's talking about the Lord? This is a precursor to the Psalms. It's a psalm of battle. Psalm 68 is a psalm of battle. I know you don't believe this, but I'm skipping points. But I'm almost done. Eighthly, choose your weapons wisely. The Church of Jesus Christ has been being presented during these days with the armor of Saul. The armor of Saul. There's a therapeutic revolution in the church. You come to church so you can get well. There's a managerial revolution in the church. You we need to run the church like we run a good business. There's a theatrical revolution in the church. Hey, we've got to have the best show in town. Harry Ironside said, remember, maybe it was Spurgeon, be a shepherd who feeds the sheep, not a clown who entertains the goats. Now, we need to disdain weapons that help us to entertain and to be the best show in town and to be superior in an attractional way than our competition, the other churches. Not a competition, it's a kingdom. And we're enlisting servants of the king, and we're helping people who know the same king that we do, and we're rejoicing when somebody leaves our church to go to another church because they can better serve the king there. Now, David says about the armor of Saul, I cannot go with these. The only significant person Saul ever killed with his armor was himself. I can't go with these. He chooses a sling and 5 stones. How big did you say he was? Well, he's really, really big. Well, that's really, really good. Because if he's that big, I think I can kill him on an off day. You see, if you're aiming at a giant, you don't want armor to come into close combat. You want to kill him at a distance. If you're going to kill him at a distance, you've got to hit him at a distance. And the bigger he is, the more likely you can kill him at a distance. The ninth thing is that David moved forward. It says he ran forward toward the ogre, and they were chanting their respective psalms. You know, Goliath was a psalmist too. He was worshiping his God, his gods, as he approached David. Even as David was extolling his God, he ran toward the danger. You know, there are these iconic photos. The Hindenburg, the Zeppelin, just before it blew up. That girl who'd been napalmed running naked through the street in Vietnam. By the way, she became a Christian. That beautiful face with those amazing blue eyes of that Afghan girl on the front of National Geographic. Iconic photos. Raising the flag on Iwo Jima, the Marines. Iconic photo. There are a couple of iconic photos from 9/11. There's the approach of the second plane to the second tower, because by that time all the cameras are out. There's also the camera, the photo of people running away. They're running away as fast as they can. But there's another group that's running in a different way. They're running toward the danger. They're running into the buildings, not out of the buildings. Why? Because they've taken a certain vocation. They put on a certain uniform. They're bent on rescue. But I asked ourselves the question, which uniform are we wearing? He moved forward. David Livingston said, I'll go anywhere as long as it's forward. The Church of Jesus Christ is like a bicycle. Either it moves forward or it falls over. One last thing. This is the 10th thing. He followed through. He followed through. Well begun is not nearly as encouraging as finally done. The Christian life is not a sprint, brothers and sisters. It's a marathon. We don't know where we are in the race, but we need to keep running in the right direction. What I mean by followed through, have you ever noticed that David killed him twice? Ever noticed that? That's what I call follow through. So it says that in verse 49, David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. That's verse 50. Verse 51 says, therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of his sheath, and killed him. Cut his head off. See? That's follow through. He killed him twice. What does that mean? Well, the stone killed him. But nobody knew it except those who were up close. Once he decapitated and held the head up, the whole world knew Goliath is dead. Now, there's no, I'm really done now, I promise. I know you don't believe me. Only the promises of God are infallible. He does something now that only a teenager would do. He keeps the head, takes it home. No, this is my head. I killed him. It's going to my room. And I think if there's anything I'd like to stay away from, it would be a head without a body. Not so for teenage boys, okay? That's the story. This is the template. Learn from it. Happy Valentine's, Tatiana. We love you.